Welcome back to the GCN Racing News Show. Coming up this week, a Pogačar performance so impressive it'll go down in the history books. But did it kill the entertainment? I'll be wrapping up the men's and women's Strade Bianche and the first stage of Paris-Nice, in which the GC favourites were already showing their cards. This week in the world of racing, we learned that Arnaud Delis was apparently not particularly pleased to be racing Le Samyn last Tuesday.
Lost a lot of skin there, was really angry and frustrated. The adrenaline was pumping. Yeah, he needed a third bike there.
We also learned at that same race that Antonio Morgado is good at the cobbled classics, but that doesn't mean that he likes them.
No, I don't like this type of races, but yeah, I'm super happy with my second.
You've got to love a straight talker. And finally, we learnt that whilst comparisons with Merckx are often shunned by fans and journalists alike, today Pogačar seemed determined to keep the comparisons going. In reality, that was the furthest thing from his mind when he attacked at 81 k's to go at Strade Bianche on Saturday. But what ensued was a Merckx-type exploit rarely seen in modern-day cycling. Pogačar had already telegraphed his attack in more ways than one. So when Philippe Gilbert interviewed him that morning and asked when he was going to attack, he said, on the Monte Sante Marie. His team then rode a very high tempo through the start of that sector. Everybody knew what was about to happen, but nobody could follow when he inevitably went. Sepp Kuss was the closest to him, but when Pogačar accelerated a second time, you could see that he'd already thrown the towel in. And that, effectively, was the moment the race was won. Maxim van Gils of Lotto Destiny, who seemed to be on the best day of his career so far, was the only rider that set off in pursuit, but he soon realised that it was a bad idea and sat up to rejoin the group behind. Now, whilst I was commentating on the race on Saturday, I was also writing down the time gap as the kilometres ticked by. 2.5 k's after he attacked, he had half a minute. 5 k's after his attack, it was over a minute. 10 k's after he attacked, it was over 2 minutes and over for everybody else. There was no sort of cohesion in the chasing group, but as we learnt from Tom Pidcock in his post-race interview, that's because everybody was already on their knees. He said it was like being in a gruppetto, just trying to get through to the finish. You can see everything that he said on an article on our website that we'll put a link to in the description down below, globalcyclingnetwork.com. The reason everyone was on their knees was because of the difficulty of the race leading up to that point. We didn't see it because live coverage hadn't started, but UAE Team Emirates implemented their plan of making the race hard the whole day. And that was evident when we saw that the day's early breakaway never got far up the road and had already been caught by the time live coverage did start, with 100 kilometres or so remaining. As if we needed any more evidence of Pogačar's superiority on the day, and on that climb in particular, we only need to look at the Monte Sante Marie Strava sector. His time of 11 minutes and 4 seconds was over half a minute quicker than Pidcock's from last year and 36 seconds quicker than Maxim van Gils on Saturday. Ben Healy, who weighs around 65 kilos, averaged 379 watts over that sector and covered it 46 seconds slower than Pogačar. Healy's average power to that point of the race was already 260 watts for 3 3/4 hours. He still raised that in the finale, but obviously nobody could raise it as much as Pogačar did. Pogačar's times over the Strava segments towards the end of the race were far less impressive. I mean, that's understandable, of course, because he'd already been solo for over an hour and had a big enough time gap that he didn't need to ride them flat out. But I guess the question then is, what do we want out of bike racing as fans? Many were saying how boring that race was, and you can understand why. There wasn't exactly a lot of suspense, was there? Compare that to 2021, where Van der Poel lit it up on Le Tolfe and then again on the Santa Caterina climb into Siena, and it's night and day. There was still a sense of inevitability that day. We kind of knew what was coming, but somehow it was still 10 times more exciting to watch in the finale. I think that's because we, as spectators and viewers, have become accustomed to some sort of suspense until the final few kilometres or metres. In many respects, that's why the Hammer series from a few years ago was hard to get your head around. The point system in those races meant that they could be won with a long way still to go, and that the rider who crossed the finish line first was not necessarily the one taking all the glory. But if you look at a lot of the world's biggest sports, exactly that sort of thing can happen. How many times do you see fans on one side leave a stadium because it's so obvious that their team has already lost? But cycling's different, and so as impressive as Pogačar was on Saturday, it left most of us feeling like we'd been robbed of a spectacle, kind of robbed of a proper race, as it were. That said, I'm not going to criticise it. There was a period not that long ago where it would have been almost inconceivable that one of the big favourites for a race went on a long-range attack. Liège-Bastogne-Liège even changed the route of the finale to try and encourage some attacking from further out rather than leaving it until the last climb. Pogačar, Van der Poel, Evenepoel et al. Have changed all of this. The first stage of Paris-Nice, in fact, was a good example, and I'll get onto that later on. I still find myself watching in awe at that type of exploit, whether they're successful attacks or not. I like the audacity, I like the willingness to throw it all on the line, to not play it safe, but I'd obviously like to hear your thoughts on this as well, particularly if you've been watching bike racing for a long time. Is this kind of performance getting boring for you or not? Let me know in the comments section down below. Just to wrap up the men's race, Maxim van Hilst was back on the attack the first time up Le Tolfe and eventually joined by an informed Tom Schoint of Lidl-Trek, who'd already had to change his bike twice and also chase back on after his own teammate Quinn Simmons crashed him. On the climb to the finish, Schoint initially looked like he'd paid for his earlier efforts, but found the strength to catch and pass Van Hilst to take second. Tom Pidcock spent the last 20 k's or so solo to take fourth, whilst Matej Mohoric rounded out the top five, albeit 4.5 minutes down on the winner. I'll move on to the women's race now, which was far more tantalising than the men's. If anything, the added finishing circuit made the race more cagey, and we had a pretty big group together coming into Le Tolfe, the final gravel sector. Ahead of that, a strong group had gone away, and with most of the big teams represented, we were all wondering who was going to do the chasing. Well, for a second week in succession, the other teams told SD-Worx they weren't going to help them, and so they had to use Niamh Fisher-Back to do the chasing. At least until Lizzie Deignan crashed out of the front group, at which point Lidl-Trek put her on the front to do the controlling. Would it have changed the outcome if they hadn't done that? Possibly. Lidl-Trek outnumbered SD-Worx in what eventually became the front group, leaving Kopecky and Vollering having to monitor a lot of riders over the last 40 k's or so of the race. From that point of view, I was quite surprised not to see more anticipation ahead of the final sector. We had a few skirmishes, but for the most part the riders seemed to be waiting for that final climb. Canyon SRAM used Elise Shabby to set things up for Kasia Niewiadoma there, but guess who was on her wheel as she went? Vollering and Kopecky, and just behind that, Longo Borghini and Van Androoy. And so Niewiadoma, despite her strength on the day, found herself in a group of 5 in which she was the only rider without a teammate. The winning move came with exactly 10 k's remaining. Kopecky put in a dig, Longo Borghini latched on despite a moment's hesitation, and they were only seen again after they crossed the finish line. There are some more dynamics to talk through though in that finale. Kopecky played the teammate card with Vollering behind, gambling that Longo Borghini would be willing to do the majority of the work and guarantee at least second on the day, which is exactly what she did, at least in my opinion. Longo Borghini could have gambled herself and pointed out she also had a teammate behind, even though Van Androoy was clearly the weakest of the 5 riders who'd made the final selection. It's always a difficult one though, isn't it? When you're up against a rider that isn't just strong, but also punchy. A few grimaces from Kopecky throughout the race gave us hope that there'd be a proper battle on the final climb, but when it came to it, Kopecky kicked and immediately put lengths into the Italian champion. So, first, second and first for Kopecky in this race over the past 3 editions, but great to see Longo Borghini back to her best after a 2023 season in which she had all sorts of injuries and illness. 24 hours later, she would be raising her hands aloft after soloing to the victory at the Trofeo Ora in Uro. Behind the front 2, it was no surprise to see Vollering take the 3rd step of the podium, which left Kasia Niewiadoma bitterly disappointed in 4th. And the images of her breaking down in tears after the finish were quite difficult to watch, but also understandable. She must be wondering when she's going to be the bride instead of the bridesmaid at that race. That was the 6th time she's finished in the top 4 of Strade Bianche. For Kopecky, it was her 37th career victory and her 3rd this year from 6 days of racing so far. She will be the rider to beat at the big classics to come, but it does feel like there's a semblance of hope that she and SD-Worx can be beaten at some big races this year. Just before I move on, a quick shout out to our shop, shop.globalcyclingnetwork.com, where there's a new range of tees to celebrate many of the big races from this point in the season, including this one, the Race to the Sun. But there's a whole load to choose from, and your support would be very much appreciated. Paris-Nice now, where we had an opening stage that was far more exciting than I was expecting. Lidl-Trek had a lot of responsibility on their shoulders, with Mads Pedersen the big favourite for the stage, finishing as it did on an uphill drag. They did spend most of the day controlling and then catching the early breakaway, but things kicked off in the peloton with 18 k's to go as they approached an intermediate sprint which had bonus seconds. Soudal Quickstep took control there, but it was Visma Lease Bike's Matteo Jorgensen who took the maximum 6 seconds in front of Evenepoel. Of note was Egan Bernal taking the remaining 2 seconds and then pressing on with Evenepoel to try and maintain or increase the gap on those behind them. He seems much more like the Bernal of old, doesn't he? Which is fantastic to see. The notable absentee in that part of the action was Primož Roglič, making his competitive debut in Bora Hansgrohe colours. However, he was a lot more attentive when Evenepoel put in another dig on the final classified climb of the day. Finn Fisher-Black of UAE Team Emirates was desperately trying to get on Evenepoel's wheel, but clearly suffering, and so it was Roglič himself who had to close it down. He didn't pull through though. He's much more of an old school type rider, is Primož Roglič, attentive, almost always where he needs to be, but also very calculating, and he never uses energy if he doesn't need to or if there's not enough to gain from it. But isn't that great that GC favourites like Evenepoel and Bernal are out there attacking rather than just playing it safe and waiting for the mountains, forcing the likes of Roglič to be in the mix too? Again, 5 years or so ago, you'd almost never have seen a GC rider on the attack on stage 1 of Paris-Nice. It would have been about playing safe, not losing time, rather than trying to gain it. I mean, I'm sure there's a few sprinters out there who aren't too happy about this change, but as a viewer, I think it's been great. That was definitely the case yesterday, in fact, with the likes of Jakobsen, Groenewegen already out of the picture with 10Ks to go. However, once things regrouped a little, we still had plenty of fast men in the front group. Pedersen, Koy, Kopecky and Groves were all there, as was Sam Bennett, who'd done particularly well to still be in the fight. An attack from Anthony Turgis was caught in the final couple of Ks, leaving Lidl-Trek and Visma Lease Bike to set up their respective sprinters. Lidl-Trek went early with Stuyven, Pedersen's last man, and he was already on the front with 900 metres to go. He did a fantastic job though, and Pedersen didn't have to hit the wind until a little over 200 metres to go. However, for one of the first times this season, he didn't have it all his own way. He was pipped to the line by Olaf Koy, who continues to rack up wins against the biggest sprinting talent in the world and over a very different parcours as well. Pedersen had to settle for second, whilst Lawrence Pithy continued his impressive run of form with third on the day. That race continues today on a stage that should be a bunch sprint. The wind doesn't look to be in the right direction to split the peloton for much of the day, but you never know. A few other races to wrap up now. Alex Sejar took his first pro victory on Saturday at the Grand Prix Quillion. Grim conditions there, and they weren't much better yesterday for the Grand Prix Monseré. Jana van der Paar capped off what was a brilliant weekend for Lotto Destiny there, out-sprinting Timothy Dupont and David Decker for the win. On Tuesday at the Grand Prix Le Samyn, Vittoria Guazzini crossed the line first for the first time in her career. All of her previous pro wins have come in either time trials or general classifications, but she got the better of 20-year-old Annina Attasalo of Uno X in the sprint to the line. In the men's, there was a close call for Lawrence Rex, who had a bit of a fright as he went to raise his arms aloft in victory. Just under his right arm, Antonio Morgado was throwing his bike to the line, and the Belgian had to wait a good few minutes for confirmation that he'd taken his first pro win. Watch out for both of those riders in the Classics this year. Just before I finish, don't forget you can keep up to date with all the latest news over on our revamped website, globalcyclingnetwork.com. There are multiple updates every single day, so you won't miss any major story from the cycling world. That is all for this week though. Thank you for watching. I'll be back on Monday for a recap of Paris-Nice and Tirreno Adriatico. See you then.